The massive doors of the Kepler 442b war room slid open with a deep mechanical hiss. 12 different alien species filed in, their various forms casting strange shadows under the blue-white lighting. The air recyclers worked overtime, mixing oxygen for the humans with methane for the Klaxons and hydrogen for the crystalline Alterians. Commander Thexval's body sparkled like living diamond as he moved to the central console. His people had evolved on a world of pure crystal, and their bodies reflected that heritage. Every emotion showed as color shifts across his translucent skin. Right now, deep red streaks of worry pulsed through his form. "Attention, Coalition representatives," his voice rang out like wind chimes in a storm. "We're facing our darkest hour." The holographic display flickered to life above the circular table. A three-dimensional star map filled the space, showing the spiral arm of their galaxy. What should have been peaceful blue and green systems now glowed angry red. The hegemony had struck fast and without mercy. General Klax then scuttled forward on her 6 legs, her insect-like body clicking against the metal floor. Her compound, eyes each the size of a human fist, studied the display with rapid movements. "Look at this destruction," she chittered, her voice like grinding gears. "The Vega system, gone. New Sparta, evacuated. The Centauri colonies, completely cut off." Ambassador Rothkai floated near the back of the room, his jellyfish-like body pulsing with bioluminescent patterns. The aquatic diplomat needed his environmental suit to survive in the dry air, and his translated voice carried a wet, bubbling quality. "My people escaped from the Outer Rim just yesterday, the hegemony ships. They're unlike anything we've seen before. Massive, black as space itself, and they move with perfect coordination." "Coordination?" asked Captain Zixandra of the Reptilian Guard. Her scaled head tilted to one side, yellow eyes narrowing. "You mean they fight as a unit?" "More than that," Rothkai's translator crackled. "They fight as one mind. No communication delays, no tactical errors, no hesitation. It's like facing a single giant organism with 1,000 bodies." The room erupted in discussion. The bird-like Avirians chirped rapid-fire tactical suggestions, while the rock-skinned geologians rumbled about defensive positions. The plant-based chlorophytes swayed nervously, their leaf hair rustling with anxiety. But in the corner, one figure remained perfectly still. War Captain Velnok of the Zephyrian Coalition hadn't moved since entering the room. His 6 arms hung at his sides, battle-scarred and powerful. Each arm ended in 3-fingered hands that had held weapons for over 30 years of galactic warfare. His compound eyes, unlike the bright, multifaceted gems of his younger species mates, were dark and weathered. Scars crossed his chitinous face, plasma burns from the Rigel campaign, claw marks from the beast wars of Proxima, and a deep gouge across his left mandible from a battle he never spoke about. "War Captain Velnok," Commander Thexval's crystalline voice cut through the chatter. "You've been unusually quiet. Your tactical experience spans more conflicts than anyone else in this room." All eyes turned to the veteran warrior. Some species showed respect. They knew his reputation. Others showed curiosity. The Zephyrians were known for their aggressive battle tactics and innovative strategies. Velnok's mandibles clicked once, twice, then he spoke in a voice like grinding stone. "I've seen this before." The room fell silent except for the hum of life support systems. 20 years ago, during the Terran integration conflicts, the same overwhelming force projection, the same impossible coordination, the same tactical precision that shouldn't exist in organic warfare. His compound eyes reflected the red glow of the tactical display. Same fear in every commander's voice when they called for reinforcements. General Klaxthen's antennae twitched with agitation. "You're comparing this to the human integration. Those primitives barely had fusion drives when they stumbled into galactic society. Their ships were held together with metal welds and chemical explosives. Several other officers made sounds of agreement. The humans had been a joke when they first achieved faster-than-light travel. Their technology was crude, their ships ugly, and inefficient. Their military doctrine based on ancient wars fought with projectile weapons on a single planet. But Velnok's 6 arms slowly uncrossed. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that made even the massive geologian representative lean forward to listen. That's exactly what we thought too. Right up until the moment we had to fight alongside them. His mandibles clicked in what might have been bitter laughter. You know nothing about human warfare. The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Outside the reinforced windows, Kepler 442b's twin suns were setting, casting long purple shadows across the military compound. In the distance, the roar of transport engines echoed as refugee ships continued arriving from the fallen systems. War Captain Velnok looked around the room at each species representative, his ancient eyes holding secrets that none of them could imagine. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper, but every being in the room heard every word. Before this war is over, you're going to understand exactly what I mean. War Captain Velnok moved to the center of the room, his 6 scarred arms gesturing as he activated his personal holoprojector. The device flickered to life, casting a 3-dimensional image of an unremarkable asteroid floating in the darkness of space. Thermopylae Station, he began, his voice heavy with memories that still haunted his dreams. Look at it. Just a hollowed-out rock with some basic structures bolted to the surface. The humans had been mining rare minerals there for maybe 5 years. Nothing special. Just another frontier outpost that barely showed up on galactic navigation charts. The hologram rotated slowly, showing the station's basic layout. Solar collectors, communication arrays, and a small docking bay were scattered across the asteroid's surface like metal growths. It looked fragile, temporary, almost pitiful compared to the massive military installations most species preferred. When the hegemony invasion began, their war fleet swept through the Vega system like a plague, Velnok continued. 47 massive warships, each one carrying between 1,000 and 1,500 soldiers. These weren't just any soldiers. They were hegemony shock troops, genetically enhanced, cybernetically modified, and equipped with the most advanced weapons in known space. General Claxthen's compound eyes reflected the holographic display. What was the strategic value of such a minor installation? That's what made it so strange, Velnok replied. Thermopylae Station controlled exactly nothing. It wasn't a military base, wasn't guarding any important shipping lanes, wasn't even particularly valuable as a mining operation. The hegemony could have simply ignored it and moved on to more important targets. Ambassador Rothkai's bioluminescent patterns pulsed with confusion. Then why did they attack? Velnok's mandibles clicked in what might have been dark amusement. Because the humans wouldn't surrender. Every other installation in the system had either been evacuated or had surrendered within hours. Space stations, mining colonies, research outposts, they all followed standard galactic protocol. Save. The civilians preserve infrastructure, minimize casualties. The hologram shifted, showing the approach of the hegemony fleet. Massive black ships moved through space like predatory fish, their hulls absorbing light and radiating menace. They surrounded the tiny station in a perfect sphere formation, weapons trained on every possible escape route. I was there, Velnok said quietly. Part of a Zephyrian reconnaissance wing monitoring the invasion. We watched the hegemony fleet deploy and waited for the inevitable surrender broadcast. Instead, we intercepted a transmission from the station's commander. The room fell silent as Velnok activated an audio recording. A clear female voice spoke in accented galactic standard, calm and steady despite the overwhelming odds. This is Captain Hyjin Park of Thermopylae Station. We have received your surrender demand and our response is as follows. Come and take it. The transmission ended with a soft click. Several alien officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The hegemony commanders were as confused as we were, Velnok continued. They ran probability calculations, checked their intelligence reports, even sent a second surrender demand, thinking there had been some kind of translation error. Captain Park's response was identical. The holographic display zoomed in on the station's interior, showing corridors, living quarters, and work areas. What looked like a normal civilian installation was about to become something else entirely. That's when we witnessed something that changed everything I thought I knew about warfare, Velnok said. Instead of preparing defensive positions or evacuation procedures, the humans began what they called environmental modification. The hologram animated, showing the transformation of Thermopylae Station. Maintenance corridors were blocked, rerouted and turned into narrow killing grounds. The asteroid's mining equipment, massive boring machines, industrial lasers, and gravitational field generators were repositioned and repurposed. They turned their own home into a weapon, Velnok explained. The mining lasers became defensive turrets. The gravity generators that normally helped move ore became traps that could crush boarding parties or send them floating helplessly through space. Even the air recycling systems were modified. They could flood specific sections with toxic gases or create explosive decompression on command. Commander Thexaval's crystalline body flickered with amazement. But the civilians, surely, they evacuated the non-combatants. That's what we expected, Velnok replied. But when the hegemony forces finally landed, they found something none of us had anticipated. The civilians hadn't been evacuated. They had been armed. The hologram showed figures moving through the station's corridors. Men and women in mining. Suits carried improvised weapons, plasma cutters modified for combat. Industrial tools turned into devastating close-quarters weapons, even simple explosives made from mining charges. Captain Park had done something that violated every principle of civilized warfare, Velnok continued. She had turned her entire civilian population into combatants. Miners became snipers, using their knowledge of the asteroid's tunnel system to appear and disappear like ghosts. Engineers became saboteurs, rigging systems to fail at precisely the wrong moment for enemy forces. The battle played out in the holographic display like a nightmare made real. Hegemony soldiers advanced through corridors, only to find themselves trapped as sections of the station shifted and changed around them. What should have been a simple occupation became a deadly game of hide-and-seek in 3 dimensions. The hegemony had trained for conventional warfare, Velnok explained. Ship-to-ship combat, planetary invasions, siege tactics. They had never encountered an enemy that turned the battlefield itself into a weapon. Every corridor could become a trap. Every room could become a killing ground. Every system could be turned against them. General Claxthen's antennae drooped with horror. How long did it last? 6 weeks, Velnok said simply. 6 weeks of the most brutal, innovative, and terrifying combat any of us had ever witnessed. The humans lost people, of course they did. But for every human that fell, they took down dozens of hegemony soldiers. They used psychology as much as weapons, making the enemy afraid to advance, afraid to retreat, afraid to even breathe the station's air. The hologram showed the final moments of the siege. Rescue ships approached the battered station, its surface scarred by weapon fire and explosive decompression. But the human flag still flew from the communication tower. When our reinforcement fleet finally arrived, we found Captain Park waiting for us at the docking bay, Velnok concluded. Half her face was scarred from plasma burns, her uniform was torn and blood-stained, and she had lost 40 pounds from the stress and rationing. But she was alive, and so were most of her people. The war captain's compound eyes grew dim with memory. She handed me a data pad with the casualty reports. The humans had lost 237 people. The hegemony had lost over 15,000 and withdrawn the remainder of their fleet from the system. The room remained silent for a long moment, each species representative processing what they had heard. That's when I learned the truth about human warfare, Velnok said quietly. They don't just fight wars. They transform them into something beyond anything the galaxy has ever seen. The war room's atmosphere grew heavier as Velnok activated his holoprojector once more. This time, the display showed a section of space near the Proxima system, where debris fields and the twisted remains of starships floated like metallic graveyards. The hegemony learned from their humiliation at Thermopylae Station, Velnok began, his 6 arms moving to highlight different sections of the tactical display. They studied human tactics, analyzed every recording, dissected every strategy. Their war council spent months planning what they called the final solution to the human problem. The hologram shifted, showing massive black warships emerging from hyperspace like nightmares given form. Each vessel was the size of a small city, bristling with weapons and launch bays. Their hulls were covered in angular armor plating that seemed to absorb light itself. 300 ships, Velnok continued. The largest fleet ever assembled by any single power in galactic history. They brought enough firepower to glass an entire planet. Enough soldiers to occupy a dozen systems, enough resources to wage war for a century. General Claxthen's compound eyes reflected the display's glow. What was the Coalition's response? We had 60 ships, Velnok replied grimly. 60 ships against 300. Our tactical computers ran probability calculations for hours, and every single one came back with the same result. Total annihilation within the first hour of engagement. The holographic display zoomed in on one particular ship in the Coalition fleet. Unlike the sleek, elegant vessels of other galactic species, this one looked like it had been built in a scrapyard. Its hull was covered in additional armor plating, weapon pods and communication arrays that stuck out at odd angles. The UES Indomitable, Velnok said with something like reverence in his voice. A human dreadnought that had seen action in 12 major battles. Her hull was scarred by plasma fire, her superstructure patched with emergency repairs, and her crew had been fighting non-stop for 8 months. Ambassador Rothkai's bioluminescent patterns pulsed with curiosity. Who commanded such a vessel? Admiral Dong-Hyun Kang, Velnok replied, a human who had started the war as a destroyer captain and worked his way up through field promotions and battlefield victories. The other Coalition commanders respected him, but none of us truly understood what made him different from other military leaders. The hologram animated, showing the moment when the hegemony fleet dropped out of hyperspace. The enemy ships formed a perfect sphere around the Coalition forces, their weapons charging with deadly energy. Standard tactical doctrine in such a situation is immediate retreat, Velnok explained. Preserve your forces, fall back to prepared positions, fight a defensive campaign. Every species in the galaxy would have done the same thing. The display showed the Coalition fleet beginning to scatter, each ship moving toward the edge of the engagement zone. All except one. The Indomitable held position, Velnok continued. Admiral Kang sent a message to the rest of the fleet. Single word, scatter. Then he opened a communication channel to his own crew and gave an order that none of us understood at the time. The war captain's voice dropped to almost a whisper. Prepare for boarding action. Commander Thexval's crystalline form flickered with confusion. He was inviting the enemy to capture his ship. That's what we thought. Velnok's mandibles clicked, in what might have been bitter admiration. The hegemony commanders thought the same thing. They saw a single human ship, surrounded and outnumbered, apparently preparing to surrender. It was exactly what they wanted. A chance to capture the famous Admiral Kang and use him as a propaganda tool. The holographic display showed hegemony ships moving in, their weapons carefully calibrated to disable rather than destroy. Tractor. Beams locked onto the Indomitable, and hundreds of boarding craft launched from the enemy fleet. 20,000 soldiers, Velnok said. Elite hegemony shock troops, each one worth 10 normal soldiers in combat effectiveness. They had cybernetic enhancements, advanced weapons, and tactical implants that let them coordinate perfectly with their units. The display zoomed in on the Indomitable's hull as boarding pods slammed into the docking bays and maintenance ports. Cutting lasers sliced through armor plating, and armored figures poured into the ship's corridors like a dark flood. What happened next defied every principle of space combat, Velnok continued. The human crew didn't retreat to the bridge or try to establish defensive positions. Instead, they seemed to melt away into the ship's structure, leaving the corridors empty for the boarding parties. The hologram showed hegemony soldiers advancing through the ship's passageways, their weapons raised and ready. But the corridors were silent, empty, almost welcoming. It was too easy, too clean, too perfect. The humans had spent 3 months preparing for this moment, Velnok explained. They had studied every recorded instance of hegemony boarding tactics, analyzed their movement patterns, identified their weaknesses. Every corridor, every junction, every maintenance shaft had been mapped and prepared for what Admiral Kang called the broken chain. The display showed the ship's internal structure, revealing a complex network of passages, emergency bulkheads, and hidden compartments. What looked like a normal military vessel was actually a 3-dimensional maze designed to trap and eliminate intruders. The humans let the boarding parties penetrate deep into the ship, Velnok continued. 15,000 soldiers spread throughout the vessel, thinking they were in control. Then Admiral Kang activated the trap. The hologram exploded into activity. Emergency bulkheads slammed shut, cutting the boarding parties into isolated groups. Artificial gravity generators malfunctioned, sending soldiers floating helplessly through zero-G corridors. Atmospheric. Processors began flooding sections with toxic gases or creating explosive decompression that hurled enemies into space. But that was just the beginning, Velnok said, his compound eyes reflecting the chaos on the display. The humans had done something that violated every law of space combat. They had rigged their own fusion reactor as a weapon. General Claxthen's antennae trembled with horror. A fusion reactor breach would destroy the entire ship. Not a breach, Velnok corrected. Controlled plasma bursts. The humans had modified their ship's power systems to create focused energy. Releases that could cook entire sections of the vessel, while leaving other areas untouched. They turned their own ship into a giant plasma cannon aimed inward. The holographic display showed corridors filling with superheated plasma, enemy soldiers vaporized instantly, and bulkheads glowing white-hot before cooling back to normal. It was surgical, precise, and absolutely terrifying. When the plasma cleared, 19,000 hegemony soldiers were dead, Velnok continued. Admiral Kang and his surviving crew, less than 800 humans, had accomplished the impossible. But they weren't finished. The display showed human figures moving through the ship's corridors, no longer hiding but advancing with purpose. They wore environmental suits and carried weapons salvaged from their enemies. They used the hegemony's own boarding craft to launch a counter-assault, Velnok explained. 3 enemy ships were captured from within, their crews either dead or fleeing in panic. The humans turned those ships' weapons against the rest of the hegemony fleet. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. The enemy fleet, which had come seeking an easy victory, found themselves facing an enemy that had turned certain defeat into impossible triumph. Ships began breaking formation, commanders started arguing over communication channels, and several vessels actually opened fire on each other in the confusion. The hegemony fleet retreated within an hour, Velnok concluded. 300 ships, the largest military force in galactic history, driven off by a single human dreadnought, and less than 800 survivors. The holographic display faded, leaving the room in stunned silence. That evening, Admiral Kang invited me aboard the Indomitable for dinner, Velnok said quietly. The ship was a wreck, hull breaches, damaged systems, corridors still stained with blood and battle damage. But the Admiral served me a meal as if nothing had happened. He even shared something called kimchi, a traditional human food that burned my tongue but somehow tasted like victory. The war captain's voice grew even softer. When I asked him how he could sacrifice so many of his own crew to achieve victory, he looked at me with those strange human eyes and said something I'll never forget. War is mathematics, war captain. The equation must balance. We saved millions by sacrificing hundreds. The alien officers sat in silence, each trying to process what they had heard. Outside, the twin suns of Kepler 442b continued their slow dance across the sky, but inside the war room, the shadows seemed deeper and more threatening than before. War Captain Velnok's 6 arms trembled slightly as he prepared to share his most haunting memory. The veteran warrior had faced countless battles, witnessed the destruction of entire fleets, and survived conflicts that had claimed millions of lives. But this story was different. This one had changed him forever. New soul, he began, his voice barely above a whisper. A beautiful world in the outer rim territories, green valleys, crystal-clear rivers, and cities that looked like they had grown from the earth itself rather than being built upon it. 3 million human colonists had made it their home over the course of 50 years. The holographic display flickered to life, showing an orbital view of the planet. Lush forests covered most of the continents, broken by gleaming cities that seemed to blend naturally with the landscape. It looked peaceful, prosperous, and completely defenseless. When the hegemony invasion reached New Sol, the colonists had nowhere to run, Velnok continued. No military fleet, no orbital defenses, no way to evacuate 3 million people before the enemy arrived. The planet fell within 6 hours. The display shifted, showing the transformation of New Sol under hegemony occupation. The beautiful cities were now surrounded by massive fortress walls. Weapon emplacements sprouted from rooftops like deadly flowers. Energy shields covered entire districts, and the green spaces between buildings were filled with military equipment and patrol routes. But the hegemony had learned from their previous defeats, Velnok explained. They knew the coalition would come to liberate the planet, and they were ready for us. They had done something that no civilized species had ever attempted in the Tazi history of galactic warfare. General Claxthen's compound eyes focused intently on the display. What did they do? They turned the entire civilian population into living shields, Velnok replied. Every military installation, every weapon position, every command center was surrounded by human civilians, children in schoolyards next to missile launchers, elderly people in care facilities built into ammunition depots, families living in residential blocks that were actually disguised military barracks. The holographic display zoomed in on individual city districts. What should have been normal civilian areas were revealed to be nightmarish combinations of homes and fortifications. Playgrounds sat next to anti-aircraft guns. Hospitals were built into the foundations of military command centers. Shopping districts surrounded weapon manufacturing facilities. The coalition's response was immediate and predictable, Velnok continued. Every species reacted according to their nature and their ethics. The Altarians, being natural diplomats, suggested, "We open negotiations with the hegemony." They proposed prisoner exchanges, territorial concessions, anything to avoid civilian casualties. Ambassador Rothkai's bioluminescent patterns pulsed with agreement. Negotiation is always preferable to warfare when innocent lives are at stake. The Zephyrians wanted a prolonged siege, Velnok continued. Surround the planet, cut off supply lines, wait for the enemy to weaken over time. It would take years, maybe decades, but eventually the hegemony would be forced to surrender or withdraw. Commander Thexval's crystalline form flickered with concern. And the other species? The Klaxons proposed immediate withdrawal, Velnok replied. They argued that no military objective was worth the potential loss of 3 million innocent lives. Better to abandon the planet than risk a massacre. The room fell silent as each species representative considered the impossible situation. How do you fight an enemy that uses civilians as armor? How do you liberate people when any attack might kill the very people you're trying to save? The Coalition Command spent 3 days debating options, Velnok continued. 3 days while the people of New Sol suffered under hegemony occupation. 3 days while enemy reinforcements continued to arrive and strengthen their positions. The holographic display showed coalition ships gathering in the outer system, their commanders paralyzed by the moral complexity of the situation. Rescue seemed impossible, withdrawal seemed cowardly, and attack seemed monstrous. Then Colonel Minho Yun of the Terran Liberation Corps requested permission to address the Command Council, Velnok said. He was a small man, even by human standards. Quiet, methodical, the kind of officer who preferred studying tactical manuals to giving speeches. When he stood up to speak, half the room barely noticed him. The war captain's compound eyes grew distant with memory. He presented a single datapad to the council leadership and said 2 words that changed everything. Acceptable losses. General Claxthen's antennae drooped with horror. He was willing to sacrifice civilians? Not willing, Velnok corrected. That's what made it so terrifying. The humans weren't eager for civilian casualties. They were treating them as a mathematical problem to be solved. While we had spent 3 days debating ethics and morality, they had spent 3 days calculating precise casualty projections. The holographic display shifted to show detailed schematics of New Sol's cities. Every building was color-coded. Red for civilian populations, blue for military targets, green for potential liberation corridors, and yellow for areas of mixed use. The humans had mapped every street, every building, every room on the entire planet, Velnok explained. They knew where every civilian lived, where every enemy soldier was stationed, where every weapon was positioned. They had created a 3-dimensional model of the entire world that was accurate down to individual apartments. The display zoomed in on specific city blocks, showing movement patterns of both civilians and military forces. The level of detail was staggering. The humans had somehow gathered intelligence about daily routines, work schedules, even the timing of meals and sleep cycles. Colonel Yun presented his liberation plan to the Command Council. Velnok continued. Surgical strikes using micro-targeted explosives that could destroy military equipment without damaging adjacent civilian structures. Stealth insertion teams that could eliminate enemy soldiers without alerting nearby patrols. Precision bombardment that could level a weapon emplacement while leaving the surrounding neighborhood intact. Commander Thexaval leaned forward, his crystalline features reflecting the tactical display. It sounds like they had found a perfect solution. That's what we thought at first, Velnok replied grimly, until Colonel Yun showed us the casualty projections. Even with perfect execution, even with surgical precision, even with tactics that defied belief, the liberation of New Seoul would result in the deaths of 47,000 civilians. The room fell silent, except for the hum of life support systems. But here's what made it truly horrifying, Velnok continued. The humans had calculated that 47,000 deaths was actually the optimal outcome. They had run probability models for every possible approach: negotiation, siege, withdrawal, direct assault, and their plan resulted in the lowest civilian casualties of any realistic option. General Claxthen's voice was barely audible. They had optimized for death. They had optimized for life, Velnok corrected. That's what made it so chilling. Colonel Yun stood before the Command Council and explained that 47,000 civilian deaths would save 2,953,000 civilian lives. The mathematics were perfect, the logic was flawless, and the moral implications were absolutely terrifying. The holographic display showed the liberation of New Seoul in accelerated time. Stealth ships approached the planet under cover of sensor jamming. Special forces teams inserted at precisely calculated locations. Strikes began with microscopic precision, each target eliminated with minimal collateral damage. The operation took exactly 72 hours, Velnok continued. Every phase proceeded according to schedule. Every objective was achieved. Every tactical goal was met. The hegemony garrison was eliminated. The civilian population was liberated, and coalition casualties were minimal. The display showed the final phase of the liberation: enemy forces in full retreat, coalition ships landing in city centers, and human colonists emerging from their shelters to celebrate their freedom. When the battle was over, I found Colonel Yun in the ruins of New Seoul's central district, Velnok said quietly. He was standing in what had been a park before the war, now transformed into a mass grave for the civilian casualties. 43,712 people who had died during the liberation. The war captain's voice grew even softer. It was the first time I had ever seen a human cry. This man who had planned the deaths of nearly 50,000 people was weeping over their graves like they were his own family members. Velnok's compound eyes swept across the assembled officers. I asked him how he could live with what he had done, how he could plan the deaths of innocent people with such mathematical precision. He looked at me with tears streaming down his face and said something I will never forget. The room held its breath. He said, "Because 2,956,288 people are still alive. Because every one of those graves represents 10 people who went home to their families instead of dying in a siege. Because mathematics doesn't care about my feelings and neither does war." The holographic display faded, leaving the room in heavy silence. That's when I finally understood the true horror of human warfare, Velnok concluded. They don't just accept the cost of victory, they perfect it. They turn moral impossibilities into mathematical equations and solve them with surgical precision. And the most terrifying part is that they're usually right. The command center had grown silent as a tomb. War Captain Velnok's stories hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield, and every alien officer present felt the weight of what they had learned. Outside the reinforced windows, Kepler 442b's twin suns were beginning their descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that somehow seemed ominous rather than beautiful. Velnok moved to the center of the room, one final time, his 6 scarred arms spreading wide as if he were addressing an army rather than a handful of military officers. His compound eyes, weathered by decades of warfare, reflected the fading light from outside. You want to know why I've shared these memories with you? He asked, his voice carrying a gravity that made even the massive geologian representative lean forward. You think I've been telling you stories about the past, about old battles and ancient victories, but you're wrong. The veteran warrior activated his holo projector, but this time the display showed current intelligence reports rather than historical battles. Data streams, intercepted communications, and tactical analyses filled the three-dimensional space above the conference table. 3 days ago, our intelligence division intercepted a series of encrypted hegemony communications, Velnok explained. What they discovered should terrify every species in this galaxy. The holographic display shifted to show hegemony training facilities. But these weren't the sterile, efficient military academies that the enemy had used for centuries. Instead, the images showed something far more disturbing. Alien soldiers practicing human-style guerrilla tactics, studying recordings of Thermopylae Station, and drilling in mock-ups of human ship layouts. Commander Thexval's crystalline body flickered through several colors before settling on deep red, the Altarian equivalent of absolute horror. They're learning from human warfare? Not learning, Velnok corrected grimly. Perfecting. The hegemony has spent the past 5 years studying every human military engagement since first contact. They've analyzed Captain Park's defense of Thermopylae, Station dissected Admiral Kang's broken chain gambit, and reverse-engineered Colonel Yun's precision liberation tactics. The holographic display showed hegemony forces implementing modified versions of human strategies. Enemy soldiers appeared from ventilation shafts, just as humans had done, used their own ships as weapons in space battles, and employed surgical strikes that minimized their own casualties while maximizing psychological impact on their enemies. But that's not the worst part, Velnok continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. They've learned the most dangerous human lesson of all: acceptable losses. General Klaxthen's antennae trembled as she processed the implications. You mean they're willing to sacrifice their own people? They're willing to optimize their sacrifices, Velnok replied. The hegemony has adopted human mathematical approaches to warfare. They calculate casualty rates, probability matrices, and tactical outcomes with the same cold precision that humans use. But they have one advantage that humans never possessed. The display shifted again, showing the internal structure of hegemony command centers. Unlike the organic, chaotic layouts that most species preferred, these facilities look disturbingly similar to human military installations, clean, efficient, and designed for maximum tactical coordination. Unity, Velnok explained. Humans developed their tactical brilliance despite being individuals with different opinions, emotions, and moral codes. The hegemony operates as a collective consciousness. When they adopt human tactics, they can implement them with perfect coordination across their entire military force. Ambassador Rothkai's bioluminescent patterns pulsed with growing alarm. Are you saying we're facing an enemy that combines human tactical innovation with collective tactical execution? Worse than that, Velnok replied. We're facing an enemy that has learned from our mistakes. They know what worked against them in the past, and they've developed counters for every human tactic we've ever employed. The holographic display showed recent battle footage from the current conflict. Hegemony. Forces now fought with a terrifying combination of alien technological superiority and human tactical flexibility. They used environmental warfare like humans, but with technology that far exceeded anything the original human innovators had possessed. Which brings me to the final revelation, Velnok said, his compound eyes sweeping across the assembled officers. This morning, while you were all preparing for this briefing, the Galactic Council made a decision that will change the course of this war. The room's main communication display suddenly activated without warning. The face that appeared was unmistakably human, a woman with Korean features, dark hair pulled back in a military regulation style, and eyes that seemed to see everything at once. Her uniform bore insignia that none of the alien officers recognized, but the authority in her bearing was unmistakable. "Greetings, Coalition Command," the human said, her voice calm and professional despite the obvious importance of the moment. "I am Colonel Soo-Young Kim of the Terran Strategic Advisory Corps. My team and I have just arrived in system aboard the diplomatic vessel Unity's Promise. We are ready to provide immediate tactical consultation regarding your current engagement with hegemony forces. The transmission paused and Colonel Kim's expression grew slightly more serious. I understand there may be some reservations about human involvement in coalition military operations. However, I assure you that our only objective is the successful defense of coalition territories and the preservation of civilian populations. We have analyzed the tactical situation and believe we can provide solutions that will minimize casualties, while maximizing operational effectiveness. The communication ended with a soft click, leaving the alien officers staring at a blank screen. General Klax then was the first to break the silence. Surely this is good news. If the hegemony is using human tactics, then having actual humans to help us counter those tactics should give us an advantage. Velnok's mandibles clicked in what might have been bitter laughter. You still don't understand. The humans aren't just our allies anymore. They've become the galaxy's premier military consultants. Every major military academy and coalition, space now teaches human tactical doctrine. Every war college requires courses in human strategic thinking. Every species that wants to remain competitive in modern warfare studies human methods. The holographic display showed a galaxy-wide map, with indicators showing human military advisors stationed throughout coalition space. The Terran Strategic Advisory Corps had become as essential to galactic defense as faster-than-light communication or artificial gravity. The humans have accomplished something that no species in the history of our galaxy has ever achieved. Velnok continued. They haven't just won wars. They've transformed the very nature of warfare itself. Every conflict, every battle, every military engagement now incorporates human tactical innovations. The war captain moved toward the chamber's exit, his 6 arms gathering his equipment with practiced efficiency. At the threshold, he turned back to face his fellow officers one final time. Colonel Kim and her team will help you win this war, he said with absolute certainty. They will develop strategies that counter hegemony tactics, devise solutions that minimize coalition casualties, and achieve victory with a level of precision that defies belief. Of that I have no doubt whatsoever. His compound eyes fixed on each officer in turn, making sure his final words would be remembered. But when this war is over, when the hegemony has been defeated and peace has been restored, you will have to live with the knowledge of how that victory was achieved. You will have to explain to your people, to your families, to your own consciences, exactly what methods were used to preserve your civilization. Outside, the sound of landing shuttles echoed across the military compound. Heavy transport vessels were touching down on the main landing pad, disgorging teams of human military advisors, tactical specialists, and strategic analysts. The night air filled with the sounds of organized activity as the Terran Strategic Advisory Corps established their operations center. The humans don't just fight wars, Velnok said as he stepped through the doorway. They perfect them, and once you've experienced the perfection of human warfare, you'll never be able to return to the innocent brutality of traditional conflict. The command center fell silent as the veteran warrior departed, leaving the assembled coalition officers alone with their thoughts and their fears. Through the reinforced windows, they could see human personnel moving efficiently across the compound, setting up communication arrays, deploying tactical holography systems, and establishing the infrastructure needed to wage modern warfare with mathematical precision. In the growing darkness of Kepler 442b's night, as the twin suns finally disappeared below the horizon, the war was about to change forever. The galaxy was about to discover what happened when human tactical innovation met an enemy that had learned to counter it. And somewhere in the shadows between the buildings, War Captain Velnok paused to watch the humans at work, knowing that he had witnessed the end of one era of galactic warfare and the beginning of something entirely new. The future would be written in equations, optimized for acceptable losses, and perfected by minds that treated victory as a mathematical problem, to be solved rather than a moral choice to be made. The war was about to become very human indeed. The end.